everyone, and welcome to episode 252 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. People have a lot of thoughts about hair, lack of hair, and facial hair. In my lifetime, I've seen people go from extolling the virtues of Tom Selleck's luscious Magnum PI mustache to Instagram ads on how to care for a beautiful full-on hipster beard. I've also seen the rise of the Patrick Stewart estrogen brigade and an internet list devoted to the sexiest bald men alive. If you're interested, the top 3 last year were Prince William, Vin Diesel, and Jason Statham. And if we need more proof of how wonderful both baldness and beards are, we need only to cast our eyes back to the Middle Ages, where people were writing rhetorical arguments, alliterative poetry, and even learned sermons on the virtues of masculine hair. This week, I spoke with Dr. Joseph McAlhany about medieval beards and baldness. Joseph is the co-author/translator of Guibert of Nogent's Maimonides and On the Relics of Saints, the autobiography and a manifesto of a French monk from the time of the Crusades. And he's the editor of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice with vocabulary and notes. His new book is Beards and Baldness in the Middle Ages, 3 texts. Our conversation on where these hilarious texts came from, why people wrote them, and how seriously we're supposed to take them is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Joseph, for joining me to talk about beards and baldness. I picked up your book and thought it was absolutely hilarious, and I'm just so happy that you're here to talk with us about it. So thanks for coming on.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, and I'm glad you stumbled across the book. It was fun to do and a challenge, but I hope people do enjoy it.
It's great. I didn't stumble across it. Peter Konieczny brought it to me specifically because he thought it was funny. He thought I would think it was funny, and I do, and I want to share it with more people. So how did this get started? How did you get onto the topic of beards and baldness? Is it just like random chance, or you've always been dedicated to beards and baldness in your scholarship?
Yeah, I have, as you can see, been dedicated to a beard for most of my life, but this really just came about chance. It's not something I was kind of interested in any way. And it really was stumbling across Burkhart's Apologia de Barbis in a used bookstore in Portland, Oregon, about 20 or so years ago. And I just saw it, plucked it off the shelf. And that was really kind of the beginning of this journey. And then I received some suggestions that Sunasius might be an interesting add-on, as well of Hucbald's poem. And so I kind of threw those together.
I mean, so I had Emanuele Ludi on a few months ago to talk about hair in general. So we touched on like beards a little bit and baldness a little bit, but this is not so much the medical or academic side to these texts. Why are these texts being written specifically?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I listened to that podcast, which was quite fascinating. But I think one of the things that I think you've been really good about in your work is making us remember about kind of the generalizations that we often are forced to deal with in history and kind of the individual moments. And I think these are really 3 kind of individual moments that do reflect some broader concerns and broader anxieties about these issues. But to me, I think each of these authors found something meaningful about hair and beards, and in some sense, it wasn't just about hair in and of itself, but the kind of reflections that they can generate. And in a way, I find what's most interesting about them is the way they kind of read hair and beards as having these kind of multiple layers. And in some ways, it's an interesting way of reading text in the world, right? Allegorizing them and seeing the kind of the hidden truths that they may reveal about their wearers or those without them.
Yes. I mean, hair is with us all the time. So you're going to be like reading things into it all the time, whether they're moral things or just fashion things, or people are reading the body constantly. So right. Do you have a sense, because these reflect sort of back and forth over a huge range of time, do you have a sense of any sort of general thoughts about hair in terms of beards and baldness? Do people always feel insecure about their baldness, or do they always feel great about their beards? Do you have a sense that there's any sort of general trend, or is it always kind of fashion?
I think in some ways it is a very kind of individualistic concern. And yet I was struck both in Synesius and Hook and Burkhardt that they did seem to reflect a slight stigma about baldness that needed to be explained away. And as you mentioned, these are from different places, different times, really even different traditions. And yet that seemed to be there, right? And Synesius was very funny about it. And yet I think the opening, when he talks about his own struggles and his anxiety about his hair started falling out, right? A lot of people can certainly relate to that. And I think sometimes the attempts to glorify baldness that we see in actually all three of these texts is kind of a reflection, you might call it like a kind of overcompensation for that stigma. And yet, right, it does possess, in certain contexts, a certain sanctity or holiness, or indicate something special and positive without needing to kind of overcompensate. But it is interestingly marked. And I think maybe on the broadest scale, it seems to be something about nature and what that means. That is natural in the sense of what should be and what's proper, right? And so, well, then is it proper and natural for particularly a man to have hair or not? Or because it's certainly natural in many cases to lose it, right? There's a sense in which natural is just anything that happens, kind of normative or descriptive sense, and then natural is having some kind of prescriptive sense. And that nature is a prescriptive sense seems to underlie these texts, I think.
Yeah. It's funny. I was asking you this question because these are still, thinking of the word debates doesn't feel like debates is the right word, but these are still concerns that people have right now. Like there's still kind of shame about baldness, which is a little odd because some of the world's greatest sex symbols right now, like Dwayne Johnson, is notoriously bald. Like people think he looks better that way. But yeah, there's still sort of these stigmas. And it's really interesting to see it coming through these very funny, but also sort of serious texts talking
Right.
about these things.
Yeah, no, and I think, that's a great point. Like today, you can think about many athletes, celebrities who are bald and look great, and right, there's kind of no issue with it. But yet, there's still this kind of general anxiety about it. And I have friends, you have friends who, as soon as their hair starts going, that bring on the minoxidil, right?
Yeah, it feels like it's a crisis when this happens to a man. And and I like honestly don't want to minimize it because it does feel horrible to a lot of people. And I just wanted to point out that it's interesting that this seems to be something that's consistent, and maybe it's time to let go of that.
Yeah.
Right?
And, there may be questions about mortality for people too, right? Because, and this comes up in these texts as well, that, it's a sign of aging, which can be associated with wisdom and maturity, but it's also a sign of that I'm moving forward. My biological clock is ticking and my youth is being left behind. And, that's something we all should probably think about a little, maybe more than we generally do.
Yes, yes. Well, this is a very youth-focused culture, isn't it? As
Yeah.
women, I know this very, very well. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get into the text. So we're starting with one on beards mostly first, which is Burkhardt of Bellevaux's poem. It's a poem originally, isn't it?
No, Burkhardt, it's really three sermons
Okay.
he did. Yeah. Well, it's funny because I was rereading it and I read them in order. And I read Burkhardt right after Hookball's poem, and I kept almost reading it like a poem. I'm like, I had to remind myself, oh, right, this is not a poem. But
Yeah, it reads like
yeah.
that to me as well. That's why that's the word that popped into my head. Okay, so what are these sermons all about? What's he doing here?
Well, he's responding to a concern by the lay brothers of his monastery. And we only know that the concerns because he speaks about it at the beginning. And apparently they were quite upset because they believed they were being asked to get rid of their beards. So the lay brothers were allowed to have beards, the monks required to shave. And so we don't know exactly what went on, but it was either a misunderstanding or a real concern. And so he's addressing them and trying to convince them, like, no, everything's okay. You're not being asked to get rid of your beards. And let me explain to you, like, the glories and virtues of beards. But also, he has to say, well, this is why, of course, we shave and you don't. And they both have special meaning. And it starts out as his defense, but he seems to lose sight of that immediately. And it starts to spin off into this kind of wild biblical exegesis. Basically, every passage in the Bible in which a beard is mentioned, he kind of goes through and gives it all these kind of different meanings. And for that reason, even though it's presented as like I'm addressing a serious issue, one thing that's always bothered me about it is like it's very difficult to understand how serious are we supposed to take this?
Yeah.
Because it's serious exegesis, right? And there's a lot of logic chopping. And, he does occasionally make little jokes, but as a whole, are we really supposed to take this all that seriously? I don't know. What did you think?
It was very funny to me. I mean, but I am
Yeah.
like notorious for thinking things are funny, even if maybe they're not. I used to be the one who laughed in church, right? Like I was that person because I do find things funny,
Right.
but it does really skate that line because he's coming out with things. I think especially if you read it sort of in the order that you have them in the book, you have hilarious stuff happening beforehand. So that might have something to do with the way I was reading it, but he has these exclamations like, "Hey, brothers, like, listen up." And then he starts to say stuff about beards are about your morality, or like some of them are long and you should be thinking about the length of your life and taking care of your sins. It's like, wait a second.
Yeah. Well,
It's really hard to tell.
yeah. And even in the first sermon, I mean, what he begins with is three types of vermin, right, that can infest a beard, right? Lice or nits. And then he's this third kind of insect that takes its name from foot in the eye, pediculum. And these have a moral meaning, right? Like whether the nit stays in the hair or clings to the skin, because it refers to sensuality, or the beard is, represents a kind of sanctity, and you're letting something's because of your sin, right? You're becoming impure, and so that's, you need to keep your beard clean. And it goes on to these three vermin and the virtues, vices, and you're like, okay, really? And if you think, are the lay brothers really the audience listening to this read or listening to this sermon be delivered, they would be just sitting there going, like, what is he talking about? Right? What?
It's the type of thing that becomes like a youth pastor meme, right? Where people are like, this is totally the youth pastor trying to bring together like a huge, huge leap of logic and being like, that is Jesus. Like some of these preachers work so hard in the Middle Ages to make something work. And you do think, is this supposed to be funny? Like there's a whole section on how beards will protect you from flies trying to enter your mouth when you're praying. It's like,
right.
Why are we supposed to take this seriously? You
Yeah.
are. I think you are. And maybe, I can't remember why he says that monks are better at this, like keeping the flies out, probably because they're holier, but he goes on for pages about flies entering the mouth.
Yeah. And he goes through all the kind of the logical criticisms of his interpretation. Like, well, some people might say, well, why didn't the beard protect this other monk from the flies? As it says, well, let me give you this convoluted explanation of why this is, right? And I think throughout the text, what's interesting is that there's never one settled reading of a beard, or like he talks about when David has the saliva running over his beard.
Yeah.
Right? He's like, well, the saliva represents this kind of worldly weakness and it's covering up the wisdom of the beard. Or you could say, well, the saliva is actually kind of like Christ. You're like, wait, what? And I think that this is an interesting thing for us when we approach these texts, right? When they do seem crazy or weird, we often have to stop and go like, well, is that really just us, right? Not really kind of understanding the forms of argument, the forms of communication that they had, right? It seems a little familiar to us, but it also seems weird. But perhaps in their thought world, right, this was just very kind of serious and straightforward business.
Yeah, I mean, I have to picture that there are at least some people in the back row that are trying not to laugh at this because,
right.
I mean, the saliva thing really jumped out to me as well because he's like, when we see people with saliva all over their beards, we think it's really gross. But with David, it was holy. And so, like, you can imagine people in the back row looking at each other and trying not to laugh because it seems like he's leading you down a path that is supposed to be funny, but maybe isn't. And maybe he was just a hilarious preacher, and this was the way to get to his flock. I don't know,
Yeah.
but it is amazing.
We only have one other little scrap of writing by Burckhardt. So he knew he was under St. Bernard and communicated with him, wrote some letters. And there's a quotation from one of his letters. And I can't remember exactly, but it is this kind of almost ridiculous Baroque phrase about, how can I address you, right? It's like a dove flying into the clouds, or it's like it's just kind of overblown. And I imagine that it was kind of funny, right? Even to Bernard, like he's just kind of being hyperbolic and ridiculous, but also there's kind of a serious point. He's humbling himself before his great teacher, but doing it in kind of a humorous way that makes a greater connection. Maybe that's something to do with the way he writes this sermon.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely memorable. I think I would go to that guy's sermons week after week, just looking forward to it. I mean, for real, because it's funny and it's memorable. And it's definitely something that I wouldn't have thought before. So it could be his particular flavor of preaching, and maybe it was very effective for him. But I had not come across some of these examples ever before. And I thought, yeah, this is great.
Yeah. So if you want to know about beards in the Bible, this is your go-to source.
Yeah, you can't get better than this. All right, I suppose we should move on to one that is... So I love Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is like a masterpiece of alliteration, but I've never come across alliteration like I have in this second source. Wow. This is like tongue twisters for podcasters. Let me tell you, I'm not even going to read it. Like it's pretty insane. So tell us about the source in the middle of your book.
Yeah. So Football de Saint-Amand was a monk who is actually somewhat known in people who do medieval music. But he composed this little poem, obviously as a showpiece of sorts, and decides to praise the Bald. And there's some connection to it's, in honor of Charles the Bald. And, 136 verses, and there's a little 10 extra verses that were added in another manuscript, with every single word beginning with the letter C from the Latin colus, so Bald. And I mean, it's a true tour de force. And it's, again, I think it's obviously very playful and very difficult. Right? And as I mentioned in the book, I somewhat foolishly, I said, I'm going to try and do the same thing. I'm going to do every word with C. I didn't quite do every word, but I think, except for some prepositions, a couple of things, I managed to do it. And the real virtue as a translator in doing that is I can excuse myself for like bizarre vocabulary and twisted, contorted syntax, because that's in a way how it is in the original, right? I mean, he really has to strain sense and syntax in order to do this.
Yeah. You wear out the C key on your keyboard.
Yeah, exactly. I actually went to the Oxford English Dictionary and just like went through all the C's to find every possible like sentence I could. So, maybe that'll help in Scrabble one day. I don't know. But,
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's funny because you have to talk about baldness without starting with a B. So you have to go with chrome domes, which I think already sets the stage for it being a hilarious tour de force here.
Yeah. There was an earlier translation. I forget the guy's name. I do mention it in the intro. And he did it, published it in a journal some years ago. And he did a lot of alliteration, but he kind of altered the letters and didn't keep to it. But he used Kojak as his kind of hard C sound, which I thought was clever. I think a lot of people, particularly who were not alive in the 1970s, might miss the reference, Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a fun and challenging read. And I think, I don't know if you found like reading it, like how comprehensible it was. That was a real challenge in keeping it somewhat comprehensible.
It was an effort to read, and that is not down to your translation, but down to the gimmick, where if everything has to start with a C, it's going to be, convoluted. So now I'm noticing all the C's that I'm using. It's going to be like twisted up, and you're going to have to really think through every line. And when you think about that effort that you put in, it must have taken him a really long time to do this because, as you say, there's like well over 100 verses where everything starts with the C. That's a lot of effort.
Yeah, and it does make sense. And what's interesting, the way he structures it is so there's segments of 10 verses, and each one dedicated to a different profession. Like, oh, there are doctors who are bald, right? There are
Yeah.
generals who are bald, right? And like saying, like, oh, see, look, bald people are successful in all walks of life, right? And again, this goes back to you don't have to defend other types of people like for being successful. So there was still that stigma of some sort.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like you don't have to write 136 verses about well, just about anything like ears or something like.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So what are some of the other examples he pulls out as big moments in bald history, like why these people are so successful at their professions having to do with their baldness?
It's funny, he doesn't really connect like their boldness to being successful. In a way, it's more kind of saying like, even though they're bald, they can still manage to be successful. So in addition to addressing some different professions, he also makes the case that there is a kind of perfection, a cosmic perfection to it, and that it is kind of a sign of a special holiness. Interestingly, he uses a couple of the same examples that Burkhardt picks up. They both refer to Elijah, who was bald, and in the Bible, some kids make fun of him. And they're like, get out of here, Baldy, go away. And then two bears come out and maul the kids. And they're like, see, like, being bald's fine. You don't want to say anything bad about the bald people. The bears are going to get you. Yeah, so there's a lot of cosmic significance to baldness, too. It's a kind of perfection of creation. And that's something that the Synesius is very, very big on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, we're gonna move to Synesius because Hucbald's work is so specific. It's so related to performance of this actual poem or reading it and seeing the trick that it really is not going to come across unless we start to read out loud. I'm not brave enough to do that. I don't know if you are. I am not brave enough. Yeah. I think
maybe
you're gonna read it.
I'll read one bit from my translator. It's better than Latin. So
now that we've warmed up, right? Okay. Okay.
See.
Give it to us.
Okay. Here we go. Chant Cleo's clear-voiced coterie cantos for chromedomes. Chromedomes, in control, command the celestial cornice, conspicuously capped with a collucent crown. Clement in collecting customs, they counsel cases for clients. Careful, Curly, chromedomes condemn crimes. Chromedome censors confirm the count. Caution! A chromedome is clever, courageous, considers a calumniator of chromedomes crippled in his corneas. I'll stop there. People
wow!
Go mad.
Well done. Well done. But I think that gives people the flavor of it because you can see it's playful, but also, wow, a lot of wild skill. Congratulations on that work.
Oh, thanks. I have to say I was a little proud when I managed to pull it off in some way.
It is an effort. It should be commended. All right. So Synesius is where you start the book. It is my favorite one because it is hilarious. And not only that, but in the way that the one that we were just talking about is very mechanical. This one is just so lyrical, and it just seems like he's just tossing off examples like it's effortless. And this is the entire point, right? So can you tell us about what this might have been in terms of the reasons behind writing it in the first place?
Yeah, well, Synesius is probably the best known historically of three individuals in the book. He was profoundly learned. You could see just from, even reading a few pages, like his command of classical Greek literature was impressive. And he also was an astute, he's a politician and leader in North Africa, and he commanded defenses of what's known as the Pentapolis, kind of the region of 5 cities that was under attack from some of the nomadic tribes. Went to Constantinople, probably went to Athens, delivered speeches, one presented as if it were addressed to the emperor, and also became a bishop. There's some debate about if he was born a Christian, raised a Christian, or how Christian was he. He was clearly not, since it's just an Orthodox Christian, but he resisted becoming a bishop, not for theological reasons, more because he just didn't want to have to deal with all the political hassles of it. But he did become one. And it almost seems like this piece was just for the pleasure of it, like the intellectual pleasure of it. And I think the way he writes, and you described it quite nicely, it's very learned, but it's very kind of like breezy and lyrical. I mean, it has some Neoplatonic technical discussions, but they're kind of cloaked in these kind of more playful phrases deployed in this playful manner. And so it's just a really fun piece. Like you said, I think it's the best. It's my favorite too, just because to me it's like he's an epitome of real kind of humanism. Like he's using his learning, but not in a pedantic way. And it's playful, and yet, there is a kind of seriousness behind it in the sense of that we don't need to take such things as Baldness all that seriously. It's not really kind of a big issue, even though there's, all this brouhaha kind of around it, or, people getting concerned about it. He's just going to kind of show that it's not, in fact, a big deal. And I think the way he starts out is quite nice when it's him discussing like his clumps of hair starting to fall out, and he starts to get worried, and he describes it as a battle, and he's, and then he says, reason came to his rescue and helped him out. Then he has this little brief dialogue with himself when like, oh, come on, buck up, right? You're someone who doesn't take yourself so seriously when you're sitting around joking at a banquet, right? You're always kind of good-natured about it, so you can be good-natured about this too. And so take all your learning and your wisdom and kind of show that it's not that serious. Like take all your serious, intellectual firepower to show that it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that thinking of it as intellectual firepower, because what it's making me think of is I was happy to participate in a conference called the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting a couple of times. And this is where like real serious heavyweight doctors, they were talking about the research, but they were giving it a zombie spin on it. And so it was fun. It was like a fun exercise, but you came out of it feeling floored by their intellect, but also feeling you learned a lot of things. And that's what this feels like. It's this exercise in rhetoric, and it's absolutely beautiful, but it's focused on silliness, and it's meant to be silly so that you're meant to laugh at this one for sure. There's no ambiguity. There's no like, are we supposed to be laughing at this? So he's targeting at first some writing and giving a response to this. So can you tell us a little bit about what he's responding to?
Yeah, so he's responding to Dio Chrysostom, who was a famed orator a few centuries before Synesius, who wrote a work in praise of hair. That work is lost. We have a lot of other works by Dio, but the only part we have is the part that Synesius quotes. And so in some ways, right, he wants to challenge Dio's praise of hair, but he also wants to challenge his rhetorical powers. And, he even suggests, he's like, well, look, Dio is a great speechwriter, right? He really knows his rhetoric. And he also, Dio uses Homer to make his case, Plato. And so Synesius is going to do exactly the same thing, like meet him head on and kind of defeat him. And he even at one point claims, he's like, well, Dio, because he has hair, he's going to praise hair. Like I've gone bald, so I'm going to praise bald. But in fact, Synesius uses the typical rhetorical trick. Like, I'm not going to make a really fancy speech. I'm not going to do that. But my subject is more beautiful. Baldness is more beautiful than having hair. And so because of that, I can actually give a much better speech. Yeah. I can make a much better argument than Dio.
So a lot of this is, again, just a flex. It's a flex at how much ancient Greek he knows. I think there's a lot of Homer, there's a lot of Aristotle, there's a lot of Plato. And this is one of my favorite moments, I think, where he compares baldness to like Achilles' helmet. And he's like, baldness is scary, like a helmet. It's intimidating. You don't want to mess with that. Yeah. This is like your Jason Statham moment, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And he even has to say, he's like, well, I know some people say, well, why do people put horsehair crest on helmets? Right. And he's like, well, you have to understand, this is the way the helmet is put on, the way the horsehair crest works, and you have to kind of contrive it to fit on. It's not naturally there. Right? And like one of the nice things too is that, he uses all his classical learning, but you get a lot of snippets of everyday life. And one of my favorite episodes, he's trying to say, look, bald people, they have this great advantage. He's like, there's a guy who down in the theater downtown, he gets up on stage and he like pours boiling hot pitch on his head, or he hammers nails into his head because, his bald head, it's made his skull very tough and thick. And so he really delights the crowd. So he's like, look, if you go bald, you will never be poor because you can always go up on stage and like put nails in your head and you're going to be just fine.
I mean, if that's not an argument, what is? Right?
But, it's like, it's like a freak show in late antiquity in North Africa, right? Like, they have those too.
Yeah, for sure. He comes out with things like one of the other things that jumped out at me was the 300 Spartans. Dio said they combed their hair before they went up against the massive army. And we all know what happened to them. So, coincidence? I think not.
Yeah, right. And the detail of the Spartans treating their hair, to the brushing and they're doing it, it's like a famous little detail in the Battle of Thermopylae. But this is one of these points where Synesius flexes again. He says, well, yeah, so Dio brings up the Spartans before Thermopylae, but in fact, an even greater battle, and in fact, the battle that avenged that loss to the Persians, right, was under Alexander, and he defeated the Persians. And in fact, in that battle, we know that they shaved their hair, and he gives a little detail about how the one Macedonian would pull the enemy down by their hair and stab them. And like, oh, okay, this is great. And so that Alexander hired all these barbers to come and shaved all the soldiers' heads. And they're like, yes, this was the key to the success of Alexander the Great's conquest. Baldness.
Yeah, you thought it was boldness, but actually it's baldness.
That's good.
That was a bit of a flex. Did you like that?
Yeah, no, that was great. Yeah.
But yeah, this is like bringing up all this stuff from the classics to make his argument is meant to speak to, I feel like it's meant to speak to the people who are in the know, who are going to have read this stuff and they're going to be like, oh, that's funny. But also it speaks to just ordinary people. Do you have a sense of who this is for?
Yeah, I think it is for a highly educated, literate audience. I'd say it is kind of this rhetorical showpiece. It is filled with learning, and not only the classics, but like sort of kind of Neoplatonic philosophy, which he was deeply versed in. And so it's interesting. While it's kind of breezy, there are some really challenging parts to translate that were kind of quite technical and convoluted, and yet try and give that more of an everyday speech. But again, I think that's part of what you're supposed to be impressed by him, is that he can take the kind of high and low and meld them in this form. But I think this was probably a piece that he showed off to his friends.
Do you have any moments that are particular favorites that I've forgotten to bring up here?
Well,
there are so many of them. You read something and they just breeze past and you laugh at them and then you're like, okay, which one was that?
Yeah. I mean, I like when he talks about Socrates on a couple of occasions, but I remember at one point he says, like, look, all you got to do is go into a museum and look at all the paintings of all the kind of famous philosophers and everybody else. He's like, it's a theater of the bald. Like, like
it's true.
And, he has, it's interesting, he also, like with Achilles, right? He's like, well, look, I'm going to prove to you that Achilles was actually bald in front. He had the party in the back because he does that detailed reading of the line famous from book 1 of the Iliad when Achilles is about to draw his sword and strike Agamemnon, and Athena comes and stops him. And he's like, see, like Dio says, see, look, she grabbed his blonde hair. And therefore, like he had Achilles, the greatest warrior of them all, had those flowing locks. And Synesius says, well, you left out the little phrase, she grabbed him from behind. He's like, it's kind of like me. He had nothing up front. He just had the party going on in the back. And then it was like, well, maybe he did have hair, but that's when he was young. He was, he was very emotional. He had his great meanness, his anger, right? And I'm sure if Achilles had lived, he would have gone completely bald.
Hmm.
Right?
Things would have gone better for him in the end.
Yeah, exactly. But he gets into this question of nature and natural development, and it gets very philosophical about it. And there's, one part he talks about, well, look at the growth of plants, right? Or a fruit-bearing tree or wheat, right? You start with the seed, right, which has the rational principle, and this is kind of Aristotelian, it's going to end up with its telos. And he's like, you can see the wonderful pageant of nature as it starts to sprout, and then you get leaves, and you get a bud, you get a husk, but he's like, but when it reaches perfection, when you get the fruit, all that frippery, right? All the leaves and the flowers, that's gone. And all you're left with kind of this, the perfection of the baldness. This is like the fruit, the perfection of nature, the end point.
This is what we are all striving for.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
the perfection that is bald fruit.
yeah.
I'm hoping that people will read this for themselves because these are really hilarious and they wouldn't have come to my attention or maybe the modern reader's attention if you hadn't decided to publish them on your own. So you've created an imprint after having taught and worked in this field for a long time. You've created an own imprint of your own. Tell us about that. What is your mission here and what have you got on offer?
So yeah, it's I started Liverhill, which was basically an outlet for works like this, works in translation that again might not otherwise really kind of see the light of day, to introduce a wider, not simply an academic audience to these writings, which again I think are fun and interesting in their own right. I also publish editions for contemporary readers in the sense that I think a lot of editions of the classics, not Greek and Latin classics, but such as Shakespeare, Jane Austen, those texts can be quite tricky. And there are editions out there with some notes, but I find that I think they still assume too much. So I've done an edition of Austen's Pride and Prejudice with notes, and I'd like to do some more texts like that, again, to kind of bring them to a wider audience. Again, part of it is just loss of vocabulary, but also assumptions about cultural knowledge that have gone, and not through anybody's fault. It's just, I think if you say Homer to a lot of students, which to a lot of people, in particular, people with graduate degrees, well, you at least know who Homer is, that he'll Odyssey. And I think there's a lot of people, they're going to think Simpson, right?
Mm-hmm.
And understandably so. So kind of reaching that kind of audience. But I'm interested in publishing kind of more translations, and it'd be nice to do some. There's a lot of great medieval stuff that hasn't been translated or hasn't been translated in 100 years. And sometimes those translations are harder to read than the Latin.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice to kind of update a lot of those.
Awesome. So you're going to continue to do this work, I hope, because you have a good nose for things that are good for people to read or fun for people to read or give us better insights into the world from which they came. So, I mean, I'm rooting for you. If people want to find your works, where do they go?
Well, I have a not great website, leverhill.com, but it's got both editions up there. You can also just search for Beards and Baldness in the Middle Ages or Pride and Prejudice with vocabulary and notes in my name, and you'll find they are available both in bookstores and also on Amazon and ebook forms as well. And of course, people are more than welcome to reach out to me personally. I'd love to hear from people. My email is McAlhany@gmail.com, McAlhany.
Nice. Well, I hope that people will take you up on it. And maybe if they have their own translations, they can reach out to you as well.
Certainly, yeah. If people are interested in doing translations or done translation work or most anything, yeah, please reach out to me. I think there's a lot of great stuff out there. Academic publishing and regular publishing, it can be a real chore. It can take a long time. There's a lot of hoops you got to go through, and it can be frustrating. And part of my mission is just to kind of simplify that and make it easier for people to get things out.
Great. I hope that people take you up on that. So thank you so much, Joseph, for coming on, talking to us about beards and baldness. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I appreciate all that you do. You work extremely hard at what you do, and it's important work. So thank you.
Thank you. To find out more about Joseph's work and his new imprint, you can visit his webpage at leverhill.com. His new book is Beards and Baldness in the Middle Ages, 3 texts. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So we're really gearing up for our biggest offerings of online courses. Between September and November on Thinkific, we're going to have at least 6.
Nice.
Vikings, violence, monsters, education. They all work together, right?
Yeah.
And your course on calamity and change, an introduction to the 14th century.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
So what do you love about the 14th century?
I love the 14th century because it's when all the stuff happens. It's very exciting. I mean, there's all of these disasters. I mean, that's the calamity part that Barbara Tuchman was talking about, calling it the calamitous 14th century. Of course, there's the Black Death, there's 100 Years' War, there's famine, there's all sorts of stuff happening. But at the same time, there's the most beautiful art and literature that's happening. There's just this focus on Arthurian culture, which I absolutely love. So the 14th century is it's the best century. Really, that's all you need to know.
And so what our students should expect when they see this course?
Well, we're just going to go through what life was like at that time. So it's kind of chronological, and that will go through what's happening in time as time progresses, but also what things were like to actually live then. So what were people using every day? What were their everyday tools and instruments and implements? And then what's happening politically, what this means kind of in a pan-European context, to kind of get into the global Middle Ages, but mostly in a European context. And then, just understanding what's happening and how that shapes both that century and later history. So, I mean, I just nerd out for several weeks and we sit together, we talk on Zoom. I talk for about an hour and then I just answer questions or we discuss things for another half hour. So it's just a really fun introduction to the best century.
All right. Thanks. Looking forward to that. So we've got that on the website itself. We've got pieces on tightrope walking in the Middle Ages, some lesser known Icelandic sagas, and what would happen if you decided to be buried alive with your deceased friend.
I can't imagine a scenario in which I'd want to be buried alive with my friend. Sorry, no offense to you, Peter, but it's not going to happen.
Well, there's these stories about one guy who did. It did not go particularly well for him.
Well, what's your definition of going well for him? Like going well means you're dying anyway, right?
He apparently had enough food to last him a while. He was expecting to be there quite a bit, apparently. But his friend, on the other hand, he became undead.
Oh, that's no good.
It's the perils of being buried alive with your undead friend.
Like beyond the obvious perils, there's the zombie peril as well. Indeed. Maybe he should have read my book about surviving the zombie apocalypse.
Exactly.
I know. Don't read it at your peril. That's the moral of the story. Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and letting us know what's going on. People can find all these courses at medievalstudies.thinkific.com. And
Indeed.
Thanks for telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone out there supporting my work through letting the ads play through, recommending my podcasts and books to your friends, or joining medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons are my heroes because it's your patronage that allows me to keep this podcast going. So thank you. If you'd like to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. And check out medievalist.net's sweet new medieval merch at tpublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet, where you can even get stuff with my super awesome logo on it. And if you do, take a picture and tag me so I can say thanks. For everything from beards to the weird, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.